like to get started. Welcome. My name is Karen Moe, and I'm chairing the Earth and Space Science Informatics Focus Group. And you're here today for the inaugural lecture for the Leptoukh Lecture. We established this new award in honor of the late Gregory Leptoukh, who was an earth scientist and very active in informatics community. He passed away this past January and was a great loss to our community, and we felt it was quite appropriate to recommend a lecture in his name. And the AGU agreed with us. Our lecture is here to promote a culture where we identify and support achievements in the computational and data sciences. In today's world, the issues of data management analysis, large-scale computation and modeling, hardware, software infrastructure, these all affect each section and focus group of the AGU. I'm very pleased to recognize our speaker today. He is Dr. Chris Linus from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and a colleague of Greg Leptoukh's for many years at Goddard. Chris received his PhD in geological sciences from the University of Michigan, and he is the information systems architect for the Goddard Earth Science Data and Information Center, which provides a huge amount of open access to NASA's Earth Science data resources. And so Chris is going to be talking to you about the work that he does within the Goddard Data Center, and especially highlighting the work he has done jointly over the years with Greg Leptoukh, and which he is now carrying forward. So with no further ado, let me welcome Chris Linus.
Thanks, Karen, and I'd like to thank AGU for establishing this lecture series. I know that Greg would have loved it, and I think it's definitely appropriate that we step back and recognize his contributions at this inaugural lecture. And I want to especially thank the Earth and Space Science Informatics focus area for lobbying for this lecture. I think it's really a great thing. What I'm going to talk about, well, the title of the talk is Bridging Informatics and Earth Sciences. And this is a look at Greg's contributions, and that bridging there is a key word that I'm going to come back to from time to time. We're going to look at both his past contributions, some actually fairly recent contributions, and I believe he's, in a way, he's continuing to contribute to the community as well, and I'm going to show you some of the areas in which that's happening. So, like I said, we'll first look at the early contributions, some recent work, and I call this unfinished business. So this is stuff that he was working on. A lot of it I was collaborating with him on, and I'd like to really see that get carried forward. I think Greg would like to see that too. So I'm going to put some of my cards out on the table as part of my talk is going to be trying to recruit members of the informatics community to take some of these efforts forward. I'm just going to give a quick background on Greg's science background. He got a PhD and master's at Tbilisi State University, theoretical physics, cosmic ray physics, and while he was there, he also began some work in Monte Carlo simulation of cosmic ray propagation. In '94, he came to the U.S. at North Carolina State, and you can see he's doing some more computer simulation. And in some ways, this sort of echoes my career. We started off in a domain science, and then started doing the more computational parts of that, and somehow sort of slipped into the informatics area. I think actually a lot of us in the Earth and Space Science Informatics have kind of taken a similar trend in that. He came to Goddard in 1997, which is when I first met him. And one of the first things he started working on was a data browser for CWIFs. CWIFs is an ocean color satellite. So in the beginning, the biggest problem we had, and this is going to take some really stepping back in time to remember. The biggest problem we had was data volume. We had this requirement to distribute 40 gigabytes a day of CWIFs, which to us was just unimaginable quantities. Like, how could you even think you could get that much data out? And the reason this was such an issue is that in those days, the data were of such volume that we could only afford to store it on tape in tape silos. And so you had the tape seek, first you had to mount the tape, find the tape, mount the tape, seek, and then read off the tape, then go to the next tape, and repeat that process again. And this is a very time-consuming process, especially if you had random orders. So our main approach to mitigating the risk of this was to reduce the volume of useless bits flowing out. So anything that was going out to the user that the user didn't really want was something we wanted to suppress. And so the CWIFs data browser was an early attempt to do that. It was a fairly simple concept, in fact, based on a previous CZCS data browser for a coastal zone color scanner. But the basic idea was to give them a visual image of what the data looked like, see if it's mostly cloud covered or not, and then make it easier for them to go to the next one, the next one, the next one, and for each one they wanted to then order that. And you see a kind of a fuzzy view of what that data browser looked like. I did a lot of spelunking on the internet to try to find some example of what that screenshot looked like. I found only this one, this sort of fuzzy thing in a paper that had been scanned up onto the net somewhere. Now, I also went back and looked at some of my early emails with Greg, just to sort of reminisce, I guess. And it's kind of a humbling experience. I realized that he was always out ahead of me from an informatics standpoint. And this was an email just a few months after he'd gotten there. And in the CWIFs data browser, we had kind of a clunky map picker. You'd click one point, then we'd go and redraw, and you'd click another point. And somebody had somehow found this cool Java applet that would do a rubber band map. I know this sounds like really minor today. Back in those days, that was the cat's pajamas. I mean, that was really a slick piece of informatics. And so Greg really wanted to get this into the system, and meanwhile, we just had a couple of launches in the past year. We had another launch staring us down the face that was not looking good at all. So I felt like one of those jugglers that's juggling knives, and Greg is the guy that's, throwing more knives into that for me to juggle. So I sort of pushed back a little bit, and if you can't read that, Greg was saying, okay, we're going to need to discuss this. We want this Java rubber band, but I had to talk with Chris, and I gave him this long list of, things that we had to tackle. A whole bunch of CM problems. Like, who knows if this Java is really going to be around for a few more years anyways. So we went through all that, and eventually they got the rubber band map. But I bought myself a few weeks of time. Over the years, this was kind of a common pattern. Greg would come at it from the user's point of view, and he would say, look, we got to put this kind of feature in or this technology in, and I would push back with all the system engineer stuff, but he would just keep throwing those knives in. And I think it's actually really important for us in the informatics community to have someone, on that science side that's throwing us those extra knives to juggle, even if we miss one or two. Now, over the years, this pattern, like I said, it repeated itself, but the cycle time got shorter and shorter, so that, maybe last year about this time, I pretty much came around within hours. I'd be walking down the hall to my office, and I'd say, well, yeah, I guess we really do need to do that. But part of that was also because by becoming more open-minded to those ideas, I think it was easier for me to think of solutions as to how we might do it. When you come at it initially from having a closed mind with all the reasons that make it difficult, it's very hard to see how you're going to solve that problem. Now, the other data problem we had back then was the usability of the data. All of the data were being written in a format called hierarchical data format, HDF. And then to make it easier to read the HDF, we put another layer on top called HDF EOS. And although HDF has a lot of richness, a lot of things going for it in terms of performance and platform independence, it also meant that we were adding a lot to the learning curve for the scientists out there, and specifically the coding learning curve. And it turns out that not all the scientists out there either know coding very well or even like coding very well. So this didn't always go over so well. And this is compounded by the fact that you had a lot of terminology just associated with the format. And the data variable names is one thing, which has stride, offset, grid, swath, all this fill value, SDS. And so some of the users were having some difficulty with this. And it was about this time that kind of a fateful collaboration formed between Leptoukh-Kaufman and Greg. And Leptoukh, unfortunately, is another one that we lost much too young. But he was at the time, he was the head of the MODIS Aerosols. MODIS is basically an imaging spectroradiometer on a satellite, on 2 satellites, in fact, and produces almost the gold standard of satellite aerosol data. Now, Leptoukh, however, he wanted to be able to explore the MODIS and aerosol data without actually going in and writing a bunch of code beforehand. And because Leptoukh was a leading light in the community, he kind of had this standing to be able to say that, look, I don't want to have to code every time I want to look at a few bits of data. And so he got together with Greg, and they basically kick-started what at the time was called the MODIS Online Visualization and Analysis System, or MOVAS, which was based on a predecessor that we were working on at the time called the TRIM Online Visualization and Analysis System, or TOVAS. And Leptoukh actually even provided a little bit of seed funding to help things get started, and a lot of the initial requirements. So out of this collaboration came Giovanni, which is perhaps what most of you know Greg the most for. And Giovanni is more than the tool, you know, the outgrowth of MOVAS. It's really, as far as Greg was concerned, it really was a way of doing business or doing science. And what Greg pointed out was that the way that scientists usually work now is there's a whole set of steps you have to go through. So you have to find the data first. Then you retrieve the data. You have to learn the formats, write a reader for the format, extract the variables that you want, and meanwhile, the time is ticking away. You'll be subsetting by space, by time, by variable, by other criteria. You may have to, in fact, in almost all cases, you have to worry about quality and other related flags. You need to filter, mask the data according to quality, according to the particular pixels you're interested in. Write some analysis code just so you can get a picture of the data. So all of this is just to get your initial view of what the data look like. And once you can see that, now you can finally decide, okay, are these the data that I really need for this study? In which case you accept them. They might not be the right data. In many cases, if not most cases, you end up having to go back for more data, and you go back through this process again. And yeah, the months there are schematic, but it definitely is a matter of weeks, 2 months, whenever you're dealing with a new data product, particularly if you're dealing with a new data system that product is stored in. And so what Greg wanted to do was to get them to this science aspect faster. So in the science, which is the fun part, we're exploring the data. You do your analysis, use the best data for that final analysis, and derive your conclusions. I mean, in this kind of scheme, that's actually the minority of the time that you're spending. Most of the time you're spending is this sort of data wrangling process of trying to get the right data and trying to get it into a form where you can actually work with it. Now, what Giovanni was intended to do was to basically take care of all of that pre-science stuff, all of the stuff where you're worrying about the search and the download and the formatting and the extraction, the masking, the filtering, the quality, and the visualization, and basically do all that for you on the server side, you know, within seconds or minutes, so that you can basically do this initial data reconnaissance, if you will, and get to the science much more quickly. And you know, if you look on the right now, the part where you're doing the pre-science stuff, which frankly for the scientists is usually not the fun stuff. You know, that's just a matter of minutes, maybe hours, maybe a few days, and then you're getting into, you know, your weeks or months of actual science analysis on the data that you actually need for your project. So Yeah. I guess this restates it. You know, so a web-based tool like this really lets the scientists shrink the amount of time they're spending in that data wrangling, data reconnaissance, and spend a lot more time on the science aspect. Now, from an informatics standpoint, this turns out to be pretty much a classic user-driven development model, because it turns out that when you put a nice visualization in front of a science user, the next thing they want is a new feature. So they start, sending in, I really think I'd like to have this feature in this visualization, or even a new visualization. And we were very aggressive about, meeting those feature requests. So that, we put that visualization in, and the next thing you know, they're asking for another feature. It becomes very much of a positive feedback loop when they see that these requests for new features are actually getting implemented. It's very engaging for the user community. And so we make them another feature. Add another feature. And actually, in a way, these features, these are, in some cases, some of the knives that they're throwing at us. It can get a little bit chaotic to deal with. I have to give some credit to Steve Barrick, was kind of in the middle of that for several years, intercepting those knives in place of myself. And when he went to headquarters, I had no more buffer. So here's an example of some of the Giovanni features that eventually ended up in the overall tool. And Greg was very good about kind of managing which features we put in the tool, so long as they were scientifically useful. So they were always looking at the user-centered side of things. On the left-hand side, there's some basic visualization and analysis, things like a time average map, time series, Hove-Miller, animations, profiles, cross-sections, climatologies, anomalies. On the right-hand side, you see what I've called comparison features. And actually, comparison features, they seem like a trivial extension to the visualization and analysis features, but in fact, when you start to do comparisons, things get to be a lot more interesting. And I think I saw in a talk earlier this morning, I think it was Rahul's talk, where he was looking at the transformation from data to information to knowledge, and that aspect of comparison that is actually higher up in that knowledge pyramid. I think that's where you're actually going kind of from the information to the knowledge aspect than just a basic simple analysis is. So in the comparison area, we have scatter plots and linear regressions, which is kind of a fairly standard, XY plot. But then there's some more interesting ones like the difference map, difference time series, the correlation map, which I'll show some examples of, and the ability to overlay one map over another. And it's not just that we're making these visualizations, but that we're doing this with essentially no effort on the user's part to have to work with the input data, which in many cases is in completely different formats. Oh, let me just mention 3 other features too, because we'll come to those a little bit later. There was the feature to actually download the data that came out of a Giovanni workflow. So after we had gone through the process and the analysis, just before you go to the visualization, we had a data file, and you could download that data file in a standard format like netcdf. We also have the ability to make a KML file, and also to show the lineage of exactly what had been done to the data, the input data, as you came down to the output data. And some of these themes will show up a little bit later in the more recent work. So here's an example of a basic visualization, a time average map. This is a dust storm off the west coast of Africa, April 30th, 2003, which we just happened to catch in this map. But I say happen to catch. The fact is that one of the nice things about the various plots in Giovanni is that many of them are complementary, and so they can be used in this complementary facet as an exploration tool. So if instead you start off with an area averaged time series, you can now go through that time series and look for areas or look for days when there's a dust storm sweeping across the area. And so in this case, you can see, there's a very clear dust storm there on April 30th. And so a lot of users will start off with that time series, look for the events, and then go back and start looking at the maps for those days that they've discovered. And this idea of using Giovanni as an exploration tool is something that we're actually trying to push forward even more, particularly after seeing talks like Rahul's talk on data exploration early in the morning. Now, if we look at that right-hand side, remember the comparison features, this is an example of a basic XY scatter plot. It's got basically a straight line fit and an ordinary least squares regression values. So you're looking at, how well do two variables correlate. In this case, I think we're looking at air now versus modus aerosol. And you see, actually, there's a fairly good correlation. But I'll tell you right now that good correlation is really kind of only for this area in the eastern U.S. And if you try to do the same kind of correlation or draw the same conclusion for other areas of the U.S., often you will not find that you get anywhere near this correlation. That's something that's not quite so obvious if you're just looking at an XY plot like this, and figuring something like that out would actually take a lot of going back and forth to see what the lay of the land is. So we have an easier way of doing that, which is the correlation map. And so in the correlation map, what Giovanni does is for each one of those grid cells, it looks at two variables and matches them up by time, and basically constructs an ordinary least squares regression for all of the time steps in that grid cell. And then we plot the correlation coefficient, the value of R, as a map value. Of course, it's going to go between -1 and 1, where 1 is perfectly correlated, -1 is anti-correlated, and things around 0 are decorrelated. Now, this is an example that I'll also come back to, which is correlation of modus aerosols from the Aqua platform, the Aqua satellite, to the Terra satellite. And we'd expect that to be very good correlation because it's basically, it's the same instrument, it's the same algorithm, so we ought to pretty much see the same thing. There's a little bit of difference. One of them is on a PM platform, one of them is on an AM platform, but there shouldn't be that much difference. And one of the odd things about this correlation map, and this is done over a fairly significant time period, is that you see this area in the middle of the Pacific where they're pretty much decorrelated. And we actually puzzled, particularly Greg, puzzled over that for a long time. And we'll come back to that, by the way. I mentioned the feature of being able to download data. And what this does is this essentially turns Giovanni into a workflow tool, a tool in which you can actually use it to create your own data products. It also means that you can, if you want a real publication quality figure, you don't have to rely on the graphics that we've produced. And because we relied a lot on off-the-shelf graphics programs, we only put a certain amount of attention into the aesthetics of it. We were really more, I should say Greg really, was really more interested in the content of what we were displaying to the user. And he was kind of interested in the aesthetics, but it was always a second tier. On the other hand, if you download that data in NetCDF, you can bring it into a lot of other tools that can display it in a much nicer fashion and give you all kinds of tweaking in terms of what your palette looks like, or what projection you're using, or what have you. So when users complained about the aesthetics of a particular graph, we usually referred them to this download feature and said, well, download the data, put it into whatever tool you want to do, and take it from there. This kind of goes back to the idea that Giovanni was really targeted at that pre-science area, not so much as your only science tool for the entire process, all the way to the publication. Having said that, it's easy to find publications where figures have been pulled directly out of Giovanni and used in that publication. Now, another thing that download feature enables is the ability to do-it-yourself products. So when the OMI instrument, the ozone monitoring instrument, was first launched, the science team did not provide the Goddard DAC with a level 3 product. And the reason was that they couldn't really come to a good consensus on how to move from level 2 to level 3. There's a lot of different things you can do in terms of which pixels you filter out, whether you average the pixels left in a particular cell, or you take the best pixel, or you do some kind of a voting scheme. And in fact, there was actually a very interesting poster yesterday by Deborah Smith, who looked at this phenomena for SSMI data, and they had 4 different investigators that were really familiar with the data, produced their own level 3s without talking to each other, and discovered some very significant differences. And so I remember at the time thinking, why won't they just give us a level 3 data product? And now I realize that in some ways they were right. There's a lot of uncertainty into what makes the best level 3 product, that sometimes maybe you just let the user do it. And so what they did instead is they gave us what they call the level 2G product, and this is a binned product where they specify a geographic grid, but instead of averaging all of the pixel values in each grid cell, they'll simply put those pixel values as individual values on a I guess it's a third dimension in this case. And now a user can come in and apply whatever kind of aggregation scheme or filtering scheme they want to those pixels. And so what we did in Giovanni was essentially provide them with the user interface for specifying some of those filters in going from a level 2G product to a level 3 product. Now ultimately, there was so much demand for level 3 products that OMI eventually did give us level 3 products. But even then, they gave us 2 level 3 products, different level 3 products for each of the parameters that we were putting into the system. So even at that point, we still had this ambiguity between level 3 data. I mentioned that Lineage was also featured. You might know this as provenance, exactly what the definitions are. I'm not going to get into that argument right now. This is an example of what the lineage or provenance of Giovanni looks like. And I have to admit, this is still fairly rudimentary. I think we always viewed this as being just the basic minimum we could get away with. And going forward, this is one of the areas where we would definitely like to step up the game of Giovanni, particularly making use of some of the interesting developments that are happening in provenance within the informatics community. And I've seen several posters already, and it's only Tuesday afternoon, that have given me some ideas along these lines. Now, one thing that Greg was really big on, I don't know if it's surprising or not coming from the user standpoint, but he really wanted good support for standards. So at one point, he insisted that the Giovanni output be available both in the standard formats, which you've already seen, keyhole markup language, and NetCDF CF1, but also through the OGC service formats, web map service and web coverage service. And this was particularly useful because now this enabled other data processors or data users or applications to consume Giovanni data through one of these services, either the map service giving you an image or the web coverage service for the actual data. And by the same token, Giovanni is also able to use data that it can fetch through standards like the web coverage service again, or the OpenDAP standard for transferring data. We actually used this in the Atmospheric Composition Portal, which is a joint project between NASA and the German Space Agency. And in this case, what we wanted to do was to compute a difference map. So this is the average of the differences between the OMI ozone product at the Goddard DAC in the US and the GOM2 ozone product at the DLR. And in order to make that happen, we needed to pull the data over into Giovanni from the DLR web coverage service, pull that into Giovanni, then bring our own data in from disk from OMI, do the differencing, and then we send that back to DLR's web portal as a WMS response. So we're using both the input and the output flows of OGC standards to make that differencing happen. So what about the impact of Giovanni? Now, we put an acknowledgments policy. It's somewhere in Giovanni where we say, if you're going to use Giovanni in any substantive way, we'd like you to acknowledge us in any papers, or basically acknowledge Giovanni in any papers that you're writing. What that we also ask them to actually send us the articles that they've written, or pointers to the articles, references for the articles. And at the same time, we also have a few folks in the DAC that will occasionally comb the literature or find instances where Giovanni's been acknowledged in the literature. And if we look at that, actually Giovanni has been continually rising in terms of the number of publications that acknowledge it. And of course, we expect that there's probably significant underreporting here. So there's a total of 600, over 600 publications by now. The actual total is probably considerably larger than that, but it's difficult for us to find. And the last one is lower than the previous ones because it's only up through August of this year. But it's looking promising for this year, so we're interested to see what the year-end totals look like. Now, Giovanni's also been very useful for a number of applications uses. We've had partnerships in the area of air quality, particularly with DataFed, for instance. You also saw the atmospheric composition portal. Partnerships in agriculture, particularly with regard to our rainfall data. Partnerships, for the same reasons with water resources applications. And the other thing that we do with respect to applications is we work with NASA's AeroStat program, which I can't remember the acronym right now, but it's essentially a program that goes out to train applications users in the proper use of NASA data and tools. And so one of the things they do when they go out to those communities is they teach them about Giovanni amongst other tools. And that also gives us a lot of feedback from those users in terms of what's working for them and what isn't working for them. There's also been an impact on education. There's a current study going on called DICE, which is using Giovanni to provide the data in an understandable form to, I think it's high school students and up. So it's really getting to the science as quickly as possible. You don't want the high school students to have to spend a lot of time trying to code something to crack open, an HDF data file. Now, there's also been an impact on informatics, which I'm going to talk about next. But one thing I want to note about these four areas of impact is in the first three areas, Giovanni is providing primarily a solution. In the fourth area, Giovanni it's more like providing a problem. So it's providing us with the issues, some of the issues that we need to deal with in the informatics framework. So Giovanni is an informatics laboratory, and this is where Greg and I have been collaborating particularly closely over the last several years. And a lot of it comes back to a question, sometimes we hear it as an undercurrent, and sometimes people will just say it right out loud. Does Giovanni make it too easy to get results? And this puts us in kind of a quandary. Because as informaticists, what we want to do is make the data easier for the science users to use, or the education users, or the applications users. We don't want it to be a sort of a sword in the stone where you have to pull it out of the stone to show that you're worthy to use the data. So the idea that anything could be too easy to get results is, on the one hand, we can't accept even a question like that, but we understand, I hope we understand what the underlying concern is there. And the underlying concern is can naive users misuse Giovanni either intentionally or unintentionally to get results which might then be believed by other people, which are instead completely spurious. This particularly comes into play when you look at some of the comparisons, because Giovanni, at least in its current state, it provides some cross-checking of what you can compare and what you can't, but it's a fairly mechanical cross-checking. It's not a semantic cross-checking. So one of the things we have to worry about is this idea of spurious comparisons, are we comparing apples to oranges, basically? Now, the other thing this does, understanding the underlying concern of users using the data without knowing enough about the data. And so that kind of leads us down the road towards providing more documentation in a more usable form and at the right place or time for that user to consume it. Because Giovanni is really, it's a different mode than the mode where you download the data, read the README, and then start working with it. That's a very sequential mode. In Giovanni, you fill out a form and boom, you're looking at the data right then and there. And so you need to have access to, all the essential documentation also right then and there. And so some of the things we've been looking at are things like, provenance, citation of dynamic results, documentation for variables. And so now I'm going to go into some of the recent work that has started to touch on this, particularly in the multi-sensor analysis area. Talk a little bit about just the general collaboration and community efforts that Greg was involved in. In the multi-sensor area, we've had two projects funded by NASA, Multi-Sensor Data Synergy Advisor and AeroStat. And I'll go through those first. So here's the MDSA problem statement. And this is kind of a classic provenance use case in a way. So we have this MODIS data, which, like I said, produces a very nice aerosol optical depth product. This you're seeing is a monthly, I think it's a monthly mean off the west coast of Africa, and this is the month that had a lot of dust blowing off the west coast. Now the Europeans have an instrument called MARIS, very similar in terms of the type of instrument, and they produce an aerosol optical depth product, roughly the same resolution. And if you look at the month for MARIS for the same month, we just don't see that big plume of dust. And this puzzled Greg for months and months. He finally ran into someone at a conference at a European conference who was able to explain to him how this happened. And unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you is what Greg told me verbally, and it's what Greg heard from the person that he talked to. But basically, the MARIS AOD is primarily generated so that they can apply the proper corrections to get their ocean color variables. Well, when the haze gets too thick, the AOD gets too high, they can't retrieve any ocean color anyways, so they basically threshold it and move on. Now that's my understanding of what Greg said, and that's over a few years. One of the problems we have here is that explanation, if it's the correct one, or if there is a more correct one, is not written down anywhere where we can find. And now I can't even go back to Greg and ask him, what was that you said about that again? And so this, really brings home, at least to me, how critical that provenance information is and how easy it is to lose that provenance information, even for, fairly recent data. So this was the basic problem statement for MDSA. We have different provenance for these two. We don't know exactly what that provenance is, and so they're giving us different results, and the big question is, why do we see this difference? What do we have to know about the data in order to interpret this properly? I'm not going to go into a long, detailed discussion of MDSA because, frankly, it's a fairly complicated project that takes an hour in its own right to explain. One thing I do want to highlight, though, is that, and this shows Greg's open mind to accepting informatics technology, is that this was kind of an early adopter of applying semantic web technology to this issue of provenance and data quality within the earth science domain. And so this is an example of a CMAP, for instance. This is just the small quality part of the provenance for MDSA that we were trying to tease out. This actually took a lot of very intensive and detailed modeling with semantic web experts at Rensselaer Polytech, kind of guiding us through that process, as gently as they could, with us trying to really understand, what this ontology stuff was all about and how to properly, represent what we wanted to represent in that. And the reason we were going for this sort of semantic web organization was precisely that, so that we could organize our descriptions of the data in a way that we could present them to users in a coherent form. And so what we were shooting for was what we call this MDSA similarity report. Don't worry about reading that yet because I've got a couple of blow-ups. But basically, if you select parameter 1 and parameter 2, and this is an example for that MODIS on the Aqua satellite versus the MODIS on the Terra satellite that I showed you earlier. And if you look at the differences, okay, they're on two different satellites. So what? One's got a 10:30 equatorial crossing time. The other one is 1:30 in the afternoon. One of them is the ascending node. One of them is the descending node. There's actually no real smoking gun there that tells you. So we had to do a lot more homework on this. And went back to that correlation map. And if you look closely at that correlation map, a couple of things strike you. The first is, well, it is kind of around the international date line. Maybe that has something to do with it. And the other thing is, if you look at the sort of angle of that bell, it sort of looks like about the inclination of a sun-synchronous satellite. And so, through some additional, in some cases, some inspired guesswork and a lot of additional work, what we finally did is, I say we, actually what Greg and his scientists did is figure out exactly what the time range of pixels contributing to a given grid cell were. And the blue is time ranges on the order of 0 to 4 hours, and the red is more like 22 to 23 hours. And what you discover is that because of the way the data day is defined for a Modis Level 3 product, that around that date line, you'll find that Aqua is often seeing the Earth at a time period that's 22 hours separated from Terra. And atmosphere changes a lot in 22 hours, and so that essentially explains that decorrelation of the AOD in that Central Pacific area. So what we try to do is we generate what we call a known issue report to warn the user that we have this issue in between Modis Aqua versus Terra, and before you go off writing a paper saying, what an interesting feature you found here that correlates with chlorophyll or something, you better look at this basic time range issue first. The second project I want to talk about that we were working on, another NASA-funded project. In this case, we were collaborating with a number of Aerosol scientists. And the goal of AeroStat was to be able to compare and combine aerosol data from multiple instruments. And I have to say at this point, this idea of multi-sensor analysis, that was really one of Greg's passions over the past 6 years. We heard it every day. It was something about multi-sensor analysis. And so this was a project that was really near and dear to his heart. It basically had two main components. The first component was being able to compare satellite data with ground truth data. And the second part was to be able to merge aerosol measurements from multiple instruments. And when you're doing, either when you're doing the comparison or the merging, one of the things we also wanted to do, if we could, was to do some correction for known inter-sensor biases, if you will. So here's I'm just going to show a couple of quick examples. Here's a quick example where we're comparing level 2. So this is level 2 orbital swath data. We actually proposed it to compare level 3 gridded data, which frankly is much easier to deal with than level 2 swath data, but we got talked up during the negotiation process to do the level 2 stuff. Boy, it did turn out to be fairly difficult. We wanted to add a number of sort of knobs and dials for the aerosols experts to be able to tweak. One of them was what kind of quality control you applied to the data. At what point did you throw a given pixel out from the level 2? And so we had, here's an example of one case where you don't quality filter, another case where we did the same comparison and we did do a quality filter. And here, I'm not even going to try to explain all of those to say that they're coming from, I think, 3 different instruments. So these are 3 different aerosol optical depths. And then finally, we have a case where you do quality control and you add a bias adjustment. And it's really in the eye of the beholder as to whether you think the bias adjustment is doing any good or not. And so we basically supply to the user, we supply a fair amount of backing documentation so that they can go in and see exactly how the bias adjustment is done. It's basically a neural network technique. They can see the results from the training and the tests and that kind of thing. The second part, I mentioned the ability to merge data from multiple instruments. So one of the problems with our current sun-synchronous satellites is that it's virtually impossible to get full daily coverage from any single instrument. So the idea we had was, okay, well, let's just take as many instruments as we can handle and merge them together and hopefully get a more or less continuous coverage. And in fact, even from some instruments, this is the case in the current Modis data products for aerosols, you'll find that there's one data set, which is what they call dark target, and another data set, which they use over deserts that they call deep blue. Those are in separate variables, and so part of what we were doing is blending those in as well. And when you do that, now you can actually get a fairly good picture of what a dust storm looks like when it's coming off the Western Sahara. So this is I think it's a 5-day sequence where you can watch it move across. And it looks like a fairly continuous pattern. So in this case, I think the bias adjustments are probably doing us a little bit of good. Now I want to talk just briefly about some of the collaborations in informatics. I'm going to touch on these because I then want to get to ongoing work and unfinished business. We've had a few community Giovanni portals. So these are cases where Greg set up a Giovanni portal on behalf of a particular community. One case is the Northern Eurasia Earth Science Partnership Initiative, or NESP. There's another one called MARES that's currently underway, led by Suhong Shen. And of course, he was a very active participant in a number of the community groups. So, this group, Earth and Space Science Informatics, AGU is one of his favorite meetings. He is very animated at this kind of meeting. And in fact, both of us, we usually absorb so much, our brains got full fairly quickly. About Thursday, we were starting to have to shove stuff out to pull some more stuff in. ESIP, he was also a very active member in that, started up the Information Quality Cluster, also participated in the Semantic Web Cluster from time to time, as well as the Air Quality Cluster. The NASA Earth Science Data Systems Working Group, which has a lot in common with ESIP in terms of what we do, and there's a lot of people in common, and so he was part of that that sort of joint group, if you will. But also, I want to highlight the GWEX Aerosol panel. And here, he was really serving as a kind of an informatics source to a group of scientists who are trying to assess the state of our aerosols measurements capabilities. And lastly, I don't want to leave off without mentioning, he also mentored students coming up to Goddard through the NASA Mentor program. So for instance, we had Nick Del Rio bring his Visco ontology-based visualization up and try to apply that to Giovanni as a kind of proof of concept. And then lastly, there's a piece of software that we developed as part of AeroStat. It was in fact part of that proposal in a way. Well, it's another case where we got talked up by during the negotiations to do more than we originally thought. At first it was just going to be a wiki, but it ended up being much more. But then we also split gSocial off to be kind of a standalone service so that it can work with non-Giovanni resources. So I'm going to touch briefly on that. What gSocial allows you to do is basically to annotate the results coming out of a program like Giovanni. And by results, I mean those graphical maps. Allows you to discuss them and then actually to reproduce results. Like I said, we designed it for AeroStat, but we can integrate it with any other REST-based service with a minor amount of coding. So here's an example of annotating the results. This is a case where I think I'm annotating kind of an unusual result at Kanpur, India, that's looking at aerosol optical depth on AeroNet. Yeah, I think this is... Right, so this is looking at two different regimes, basically, during different seasons. I had no idea why this was happening. I put in a comment saying, why does this happen? In fact, the other odd thing is I saw it in the non-seasonal graph, but when I confined it to a seasonal, so just looking at a couple of months, then it sort of disappeared. And then Greg responded talking about exactly what the reason was through that gSocial tool. And then the really nice thing about it, though, is that it stores the URL that produced that result. And so you can come back, you can hit the load result button and actually rerun that exact process. In fact, in some cases, you might actually want to rerun it but tweak the criteria a little bit. So now briefly, I'm going to try to go through some of the unfinished business and see how many people I can recruit, to help me finish some of this out and take it forward. There are a couple things underway. One of them was data. He was very interested in data quality. We were just starting to ramp up in the information quality cluster. We've also been re-architecting Giovanni from its current version, Giovanni 3 to Giovanni 4, trying to make it faster, better, and cheaper. And then there's a nascent feature that he always wanted that we called myGiovanni, which is what I'm going to finish on. So in data quality, one of the things we wanted to do was to characterize the quality to start with. Now look at the variations in bias, for instance, which are manifold, as well as look at the quality needs for different user types. In fact, different quality dimensions. Quality is really, we learned finally, in the eye of the beholder, so it's not always what the producer thinks of as being quality. And in this process, he was fairly active in the QA for EO group, as well as the, like I mentioned, he started up the ESIP Information Quality Cluster, which has now been essentially rebooted under Brent Maddox from University of Wisconsin. This is one of the things we were doing with quality. This was back on the MDSA collaboration with RPI. And here what we're trying to do is just to break down the bias of modus versus ground truth, but present it in a way that's understandable and familiar. And so we kind of took the approach of modeling it after the food labels that you see on packages of food. I mentioned Giovanni 4, the next generation. One of the things we want to do there is to really emphasize that exploration aspect. Part of this is the direction we were going in anyways, but part of it is also being driven by talks, like the one that Rahul gave earlier on data exploration, or data prospecting, I think the term was. But also working towards a true collaboration with the end users, going beyond that case where they just send us feature requests and we implement them. So here's an example of that exploration capability. This is an interactive scatterplot that's been recently implemented, should be released this week as part of the first release of Giovanni 4. And what it allows you to do is to, for instance, zoom in on the scatterplot, in a certain range of the scatterplot. What we'll do then is then show you the points on the map where those particular points of the scatter plot came from. And you can actually even click on an individual point, and it'll just show that one point on the map. And this is really important because the first thing that the scientists want to do, we tested this in real life, when they see a scatter plot, is they zoom in on the outliers. And so we'd take a scatter plot to scientists and say, I'll bet that's a coastal station. And the current system, there's really no way to tell easily. But in this case, it's just a matter of clicking that point, and you can see instantaneously, is that a coastal station? And then likewise, you can examine a subregion of the map. And so if you zoom in on that map area, then we'll just show the area, the points from that area on the scatter plot, as well as recalculate the regression equation. One of the things we're trying to improve is G3 performance. It's one of the things we need to get to for true data prospecting. In the current G3, if you try to do more than 1 year of modus daily AOD, for instance, we know it's going to take a long time. And so we give you a little warning. We say, okay, go grab a cup of coffee. So in G4, trying to go faster, what I did is I computed for one particular service what that coffee line was in terms of seconds. I think it turns out to be about 240 seconds. And then the goal was to see how many years of data could we process in G4 and still stay under that coffee line. And so for G4, it turns out we can get to 8, maybe 9 years of data before we have to tell you to go get a cup of coffee. And by then, it's probably no point to doing it. So yeah, it's good for the users, but maybe not so much for the baristas. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of participatory design, or myGiovanni. And we've gotten this request from time to time. We get a few of these requests, I don't know, maybe a few requests every quarter. And it's a user that wants to put their stuff into Giovanni. They don't want to, right now Giovanni's kind of a walled garden. All you can really see is the stuff that we in the Goddard DAC put into that Giovanni for you to see. And so we've started very simply, and this is a very recent development. And in fact, the idea that we could even get to myGiovanni, I only realized as I was preparing this talk for AGU. And this is why I say that Greg is really still contributing, because if I had been preparing that talk, some of the ideas that you see on this slide might not have materialized, or might have materialized, weeks, months, years later, who knows what. So the first thing we did is we basically implement the state inside the URL. So as you fill out a Giovanni form, we change the URL, which means if you bookmark that URL and come back into it, it'll come back in with the form already filled out. And this essentially gives you the ability to design your own sort of portal to Giovanni. It's a kind of a low-tech way, but it works. Now the next thing, and this is actually going to be coming up probably in just the next couple of months, is the idea of being able to put your own palette into any one of those maps. And by standardizing on Web Map Service for the map images and using style layer descriptors, I think we'll actually be able to do that in a fairly easy and straightforward manner, just by telling you to give us a URL to a style layer descriptor that describes your palette in XML. Now we start to get a little bit more difficult. We know some users want to put their own mask in, for instance. Maybe it's a land sea mask, maybe it's a watershed or something like that. I think that we can do this if we standardize on the formats of the mask, and so we're definitely going to be looking at this hard, over the next few months to see if we can put that in as well. What a lot of them are really asking for is, can I do my own data? And again, I think if we hew to those standards, the NetCDF CF1 standard, perhaps OpenDAP as access or WCS as access, and you've already seen that Giovanni can access that data. If we keep to that standard, then we can support the idea of putting my data in. And lastly, we have the idea of putting my own algorithm in. And here I have to confess, I still don't have a clue. But I'm really watching closely some of the talks that I've seen this week to see if I can get a clue. And I'm starting to get some glimmers. Now, this participatory design, it doesn't have to be Giovanni. I'm kind of looking to the entire community to look towards this participatory design, because this is what can really engage the domain scientists in a more or less continual dialogue with informatics. If we can get to participatory design, then we'll have a much better insight into exactly how they're doing their work. We'll get faster feedback from informatics into what they're doing and everything. I don't know that we'll reach the singularity, but I see it accelerating. So lastly, I guess my charge to the informatics community, what I want to ask you to do to carry on this unfinished business, multi-sensor analysis. I think we're going to see more and more of that as we try to look at earth science systematics. Data quality, participate. If you're in ESEP, check out that information quality cluster. The idea of participatory design, which again, I think that can be a real game changer for us. And the last thing I want to say is to build bridges. So Giovanni, we call it the bridge between data and science. But it's important to remember that it's not just between data and science, the bridge that we need. We also need the bridge between informatics and earth sciences. And so here I want to close with a picture of Greg at the QA for EO meeting. This is where he's really in his element, being there amongst all the scientists, trying to solve the science problems that QA for EO was working on. Thank you.
We've run out of time for questions, but I'd like to encourage you to come by to the Earth and Space Science Informatics reception later. But I would like to present to Chris the first Leptoukh Lecture certificate in recognition of his contribution in this award. Chris, thank you.
Karen.